If someone had told me that the hardest business trip of my life would have nothing to do with work, I would have smiled politely and kept walking. My name is Rebecca Hayes. I was 48 years old on the morning I walked into Ashford Interior Design carrying nothing but a leather portfolio, a paper cup of coffee, and the quiet determination of a woman trying to rebuild a life that had collapsed without making much noise. 6 months earlier, I had signed the final divorce papers after 24 years of marriage. There had been no dramatic arguments in the courtroom. Nos shouting, nos lamdors. Just two exhausted people admitting that they had been pretending for far too long. Everyone told me it was the beginning of a new chapter. What they never mentioned was how terrifying a blank page could feel. My new office occupied the top 2 floors of a restored brick building overlooking Boston Harbor. Sunlight poured through floor-to-ceiling windows, reflecting off polished wood floors and glass conference rooms where conversations seemed to happen faster than I could follow. I straightened the sleeves of my navy blazer before stepping out of the elevator, reminding myself that experience still mattered even if confidence had become something I borrowed one morning at a time. Human Resources handed me a visitor badge, introduced me to a dozen smiling faces whose names disappeared almost instantly, and pointed me toward my desk. Fresh flowers sat beside my computer with a small welcome card signed by the design team. I ran my fingertips across the smooth paper, surprised by how something so simple could make an unfamiliar place feel almost safe. Before I had even finished organizing my notebooks, a woman appeared beside my desk. "Miss Hayes?" she asked with an easy smile. "Claire would like to see you." My stomach tightened. Every new employee worries about making a mistake on the first day. I mentally reviewed every conversation from the past hour, wondering what I had already done wrong. The executive office overlooked the harbor, where sailboats drifted across calm blue water beneath a clear autumn sky. Claire Donovan stood near the window studying. Architectural drawings spread across a long oak table. She was 41, poised without appearing distant, wearing a charcoal suit that matched the quiet confidence in her posture. When she turned toward me, her expression softened in a way I had not expected from the chief executive officer of a nationally respected design firm. "Rebecca," she said, offering her hand. "Welcome." Her handshake was steady, warm, and brief. She invited me to sit before taking the chair across from mine instead of remaining behind her desk. The gesture erased just enough of the distance between us to catch me off guard. We spoke about my previous projects, my years designing residential spaces, and the portfolio I had submitted weeks earlier. She asked thoughtful questions, listening carefully instead of rushing through polite introductions. More than once I caught myself forgetting she was interviewing me all over again. Then, without warning, she closed the portfolio and looked directly into my eyes. "I need someone to accompany me on a client trip to the coast of Maine tomorrow morning," she said calmly. "I would like that person to be you." I stared at her, convinced I had misunderstood. "Tomorrow?" I asked. She nodded once. 3 days. Important client. Small team. "I believe you are exactly who this project needs." My first instinct was to refuse. I had not even learned where the coffee machine was. "Surely someone else is better prepared," I said. Claire smiled, almost as though she had expected the answer. Sometimes preparation matters less than perspective. She stood and walked toward the window, watching a flock of seagulls circle above the harbor before quietly adding, "Pack for cool evenings. We leave at 7. As I stepped back into the hallway carrying my untouched notebook, every conversation around me faded into the background. It was my first day. I barely knew anyone in the building. Yet somehow the most important woman in the company had chosen me for a journey I had never imagined taking. And although I could not explain why, something deep inside me whispered that this invitation had very little to do with business. Sleep never truly came that night. I kept replaying the conversation in Claire's office, searching for a practical explanation that refused to appear. By 5:30 the next morning, I was already standing outside my apartment building with a small rolling suitcase, watching the first pale light spread across the Boston skyline. The city looked quieter than usual, as though it had not quite decided to wake up. A black company SUV pulled to the curb exactly at 7. The driver stepped out to load my luggage while the rear passenger door opened from the inside. Claire looked up from a folder resting on her lap and greeted me with the same calm smile she had worn the day before. "Good morning, Rebecca." I settled into the seat beside her, still wondering why the chief executive officer of a successful design firm was spending 3 days traveling with someone who had barely completed her first day at work. As the skyline slowly disappeared behind us, silence filled the car. It never felt uncomfortable. Claire reviewed architectural sketches while I watched the highway unwind toward northern New England, where trees had already begun dressing themselves in brilliant shades of crimson, amber, and gold. Nearly an hour passed before she quietly closed the folder. "Tell me something that was not on your resume," she said. I looked out the window for a moment before answering. "I almost left this profession after my divorce." She did not interrupt. "Designing beautiful homes became difficult after I stopped believing one could ever feel like mine again." Claire nodded thoughtfully. "Sometimes the places we create for other people become easier to understand than the places we carry inside ourselves." Her words settled gently somewhere deep within me. We stopped at a small roadside cafe overlooking a peaceful lake where morning mist still floated above the water. The waitress greeted Claire by name, surprising me. "You come here often?" I asked after we found a table near the window. Claire smiled. "Whenever I need to think before making an important decision." I glanced toward the lake. "Is this project that important?" She stirred her coffee slowly before meeting my eyes. "Yes, but perhaps not for the reasons everyone else believes." Before I could ask what she meant, our breakfast arrived. Fresh blueberry pancakes, scrambled eggs, and steaming coffee filled the table with comforting warmth. We talked about books instead of business. She admitted that she always packed at least one novel for every work trip because hotel rooms felt less lonely when stories traveled with her. I laughed softly and confessed that my suitcase contained 2 novels even though we would only be gone 3 days. "I suspected as much," she replied with a quiet grin that somehow made me feel understood without needing another explanation. Back on the road, the landscape gradually changed from busy highways to winding coastal routes lined with evergreen forests and glimpses of the Atlantic Ocean sparkling beneath bright autumn sunlight. Claire lowered the passenger window just enough to let cool ocean air drift into the car. "Whenever life becomes too loud," she said almost to herself, "I come back to the coast. The sea has a way of reminding me that everything keeps moving." I turned toward her, noticing for the first time that the confident executive everyone admired carried a quiet sadness she never allowed into the office. She caught me looking and offered a small, almost embarrassed smile before changing the subject to the client presentation waiting for us the next morning. By late afternoon we reached a charming seaside town where weathered fishing boats rocked gently in the harbor and white-clapboard buildings overlooked narrow streets lined with bookstores, cafes, and flower boxes overflowing with late-season blooms. Our hotel sat on a rocky bluff facing the ocean. As the receptionist searched for our reservation, her expression shifted unexpectedly. "I am very sorry," she said. "The unexpected storm last night damaged several rooms. We only have one executive coastal suite available until tomorrow." Claire and I exchanged a brief glance, and for reasons I could not explain, I felt as though the journey had only just begun. Claire thanked the receptionist with effortless composure, as though unexpected complications were simply another item on an ordinary agenda. "One suite. We'll be fine," she said before turning toward me. "There are 2 bedrooms connected by a shared living room. I hope that does not make you uncomfortable." I shook my head, although my heartbeat suggested otherwise. "Not at all." The elevator climbed slowly toward the top floor while neither of us spoke. Outside the glass walls, waves rolled against dark granite cliffs beneath a sky brushed with soft lavender as evening settled over the Atlantic. When the suite door opened, I understood why every other room had already been claimed. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the ocean, where the fading sunlight painted ribbons of silver across the water. A stone fireplace occupied one corner of the living room, and 2 separate bedrooms extended from opposite sides of the suite, creating privacy without complete distance. Claire placed her briefcase beside the dining table before opening the curtains even farther. "The view is the best part," she said quietly. "It reminds you that some things are worth slowing down for." I carried my suitcase into the bedroom on the left, unpacked only what I needed, and stood for a moment staring at the endless horizon outside my window. The steady rhythm of the waves felt strangely familiar, almost comforting, as though the ocean had been waiting patiently for me to arrive. An hour later we met again in the living room, both changed into casual sweaters after the long drive. Claire suggested taking a walk before dinner since the weather had cleared. The air outside carried the crisp scent of salt, pine, and approaching autumn evenings. Fishing boats drifted lazily inside the harbor while seagulls circled above weathered docks where local families finished unloading the day's catch. We walked side by side along the waterfront without the pressure of office titles or conference schedules. Claire greeted shop owners by name, accepted a sample of homemade fudge from an elderly woman behind a candy counter, and stopped to admire paintings displayed outside a small coastal gallery. Watching her move through the town, I realized the confident executive I knew in Boston became someone noticeably lighter here. She smiled more often. She lingered instead of rushing. She listened instead of leading. "You know this place well," I observed as we paused beside a lighthouse overlooking the sea. She rested both hands on the wooden railing. "I come here whenever I need to remember who I was before work became my entire identity." Her words stayed with me as we watched the tide slowly rise beneath us. Later we found a family-owned seafood restaurant overlooking the harbor. I ordered grilled salmon while Claire chose lobster chowder served with warm sourdough bread. We spoke about architecture only briefly before the conversation wandered toward childhood memories, favorite novels, and the unexpected ways people rebuilt their lives after disappointment. I admitted that learning to eat alone after my divorce had been harder than learning to sleep alone. Claire lowered her spoon and looked at me with quiet understanding. "Loneliness is rarely about empty chairs," she said softly. "It is about believing no one notices the space beside you anymore." I could not remember the last time someone had understood my thoughts before I finished explaining them. As we walked back toward the hotel beneath a sky filled with brilliant stars, a cool breeze swept across the shoreline. Instinctively, Claire reached toward my elbow just as my foot slipped slightly on the uneven stone path. Her hand steadied me for only a moment before gently letting go. The gesture was simple, respectful, and over almost instantly, yet the warmth lingered long after we continued walking. Neither of us mentioned it. Back inside the suite, I noticed Claire place a worn leather journal on the coffee table, while she answered a brief telephone call on the balcony. The journal slipped open on its own, revealing a pressed wildflower and a handwritten sentence across the top of the page. Before I could look away, 5 words caught my eye. "Do not let her disappear again." Rain settled over the harbor with quiet determination, turning the windows of our suite into watercolor paintings of gray skies and restless waves. The postponed train meant another unexpected evening by the coast, and for reasons I could not explain, I found myself grateful. Instead of frustrated, Claire set her laptop on the dining table, reviewed a few client notes, and then closed the screen with a tired smile. "I think we have earned one evening without floor plans," she said. I laughed softly. I was beginning to think architects dreamed in blueprints. She tilted her head with playful disbelief. "Only on stressful days." An hour later we wandered through the nearly empty streets beneath matching umbrellas, while a gentle rain washed the sidewalks clean. Most of the shops had already closed, but warm lights still glowed inside a small independent bookstore tucked between a bakery and an antique shop. Claire paused outside the window. "May we?" she asked. I nodded before she even finished the sentence. The familiar scent of old paper and polished wood welcomed us the moment we stepped inside. Shelves stretched from floor to ceiling, and soft jazz drifted through hidden speakers somewhere near the back of the store. We separated naturally, each disappearing into different aisles before meeting again near a display of classic novels. Claire held up a weathered copy of The Secret Garden. "Whenever life becomes complicated, I read this again," she admitted. I smiled. "Mine is To Kill a Mockingbird." She looked at me with quiet amusement. I knew it would be something that believed people could become better. Her words lingered long after I slipped the novel back onto the shelf. The owner invited us to stay for an informal poetry reading beginning in a few minutes. Barely a dozen people gathered near the fireplace while rain tapped gently against the windows. We listened as strangers shared stories about loss, hope, forgiveness, and unexpected beginnings. One elderly woman finished by saying, "Sometimes the bravest journey is only 12 inches long. It is the distance from protecting your heart to opening it again." No one spoke afterward. No one needed to. On the walk back to the hotel, the rain had almost disappeared, leaving the streets shining beneath old lanterns. Claire broke the silence first. Do you ever wonder how different life might have been if one small decision had changed? I looked toward the ocean before answering. Every day. She nodded slowly. So do I. Back at the suite, we ordered simple room service instead of searching for another restaurant. Tomato soup, grilled sandwiches, and fresh fruit arrived on a wooden tray that somehow felt more comforting than elegant dinners ever could. We carried our plates to the balcony where waves rolled steadily beneath a moon hidden behind drifting clouds. The conversation wandered naturally from books to travel, then to family, then finally toward the quiet places both of us usually avoided. I admitted that after my divorce I had stopped believing anyone would ever truly choose me again. Claire rested her mug between both hands and looked toward the dark horizon. Being chosen can be frightening, she whispered. Especially when you have already lost someone you trusted. Her honesty made me brave enough to ask the question that had lived quietly inside me since Boston. Why did you really choose me for this trip? Claire looked down for several long seconds before standing and walking inside. She crossed the living room to her leather briefcase, opened a slim folder, and returned carrying a single document. Without saying a word, she placed it gently into my hands. It was my original job application. Across the first page, written in elegant blue ink, was one handwritten sentence. Interview immediately. Do not lose this candidate. Claire Donovan. My breath caught as I looked up at her, suddenly realizing that this journey had begun long before I ever walked through the company's front doors. For several long seconds I could not say a single word. My fingers rested on the edge of the application as though the paper itself had become unexpectedly fragile. The blue ink looked ordinary, yet it carried the weight of every question that had quietly followed me since my first morning at the company. I looked up at Claire, searching her face for an explanation that would somehow make everything feel less impossible. She met my eyes without looking away. You deserve the truth, she said softly. I should have told you sooner. We settled into opposite chairs beside the balcony doors while the distant sound of waves drifted through the room like a steady heartbeat. Claire folded her hands together before speaking again. When Human Resources forwarded your application, they included a personal statement. Most candidates wrote about awards or major projects. You wrote about rebuilding a home after your own life stopped feeling like one. I remembered the paragraph immediately. I had almost deleted it before submitting the application because it felt too honest for a professional document. Claire smiled faintly. It reminded me that design is never only about walls or furniture. It is about giving people somewhere they can breathe again. I lowered my eyes to the folder resting on my lap. You chose me because of one paragraph? She shook her head. Because of what that paragraph revealed. Skill can be taught. Compassion cannot. The room fell quiet again. Outside, the rain had finally stopped, leaving the ocean silver beneath scattered moonlight. The trip was never a test, Claire continued. I wanted to know whether the person behind those words was real. I laughed softly, almost in disbelief. And she answered without hesitation. She is even better than I imagined. Heat rose gently into my face, and for the first time in years I felt genuinely seen instead of simply evaluated. The next morning we returned to Boston beneath bright blue skies. The drive felt shorter, perhaps because conversation came more easily now. We spoke about favorite cities, forgotten dreams, and the surprising comfort of beginning again after believing life had already chosen its final direction. By the time the familiar skyline appeared ahead of us, I almost wished the highway had stretched another 100 miles. Reality returned the moment we entered the office. Conversations paused ever so slightly as Claire and I walked through the lobby together. A few curious glances followed us toward the elevators before people quickly returned to their work. I tried to dismiss the feeling, but something had changed. That afternoon an anonymous message appeared in the company group chat questioning why the newest employee had accompanied the chief executive officer on such an important project. Someone joked that fast promotions must come with private road trips. Another person replied with a laughing emoji. The comments disappeared a few minutes later after an administrator removed them, but the damage had already settled quietly across the office. I closed my laptop without finishing another sentence. Claire appeared beside my desk a few minutes later. Walk with me, she said gently. We crossed the rooftop terrace overlooking the harbor where cool autumn wind carried the scent of salt and distant rain. She leaned against the railing, looking out over the water instead of toward me. "I am sorry," she whispered. "This is exactly what I hoped would never happen." I turned toward her, surprised by the sadness in her voice. "None of this is your fault." Claire closed her eyes for a brief moment before reaching into her coat pocket. She removed a sealed envelope bearing the company letterhead, then held it in her hands without opening it. "There is something else you need to know," she said quietly. "I made a decision before we ever left for Maine, and after today, I think you deserve to understand why." Claire looked at the unopened envelope for several seconds before placing it gently into my hands. I recognized her signature immediately. It was addressed to the chairman of the board. I hesitated before opening it, but she gave me a small nod. Inside was a formal resignation letter. The effective date was 3 weeks away. My eyes moved slowly across the page before returning to her. "You were leaving?" I asked, barely able to hear my own voice. Claire leaned against the railing, watching a sailboat drift across the harbor below us. "I had already decided before I asked you to come to Maine." Nothing around us seemed to move anymore. The city continued humming beneath the rooftop, yet everything inside me became perfectly still. "Why?" I whispered. She smiled, but sadness softened the corners of her eyes. "Because somewhere along the way I stopped recognizing the person I had become. Every promotion demanded another piece of me. Every success came with another sacrifice. I was leading a company that designed beautiful homes, while I no longer had a life that felt like one." The words echoed the sentence I had once written in my application. I finally understood why she had noticed it. She had been living the same loneliness. "Then why stay until now?" I asked. Claire exhaled slowly. "Because I wanted to leave knowing the company would still believe in people who design with compassion instead of ego." Then your application arrived. I looked down at the resignation letter again. "This is because of me." She shook her head immediately. "No. It is because meeting you reminded me that I had already made the right decision." We stood together in silence until the cool wind carried the sound of church bells across the harbor. For the first time, the distance between chief executive officer and employee felt completely unimportant. What remained were simply two women who understood what it meant to rebuild a life, after watching it quietly fall apart. The following week became strangely difficult. Rumors spread through the office faster than facts ever could. Some people assumed I had received special treatment. Others quietly stopped inviting me into casual conversations. No one confronted me directly, yet the invisible distance was impossible to ignore. I buried myself in work, hoping excellent designs would eventually speak louder than whispered speculation. Claire remained unfailingly professional. Every meeting included other managers. Every conversation happened with doors open. If anything, she became more careful than before, and somehow that hurt even more. One Thursday afternoon, Human Resources informed me that another anonymous complaint had reached the board. There would be an internal review of executive travel procedures. Nothing in the investigation mentioned my name directly, but everyone understood why it had started. I sat alone in the conference room after the meeting ended, staring at unfinished design sketches that had suddenly become impossible to see clearly. A few minutes later, Claire entered quietly carrying 2 cups of coffee. She placed one beside me before taking the chair across the table instead of the one beside me. The extra distance felt deliberate, necessary, painful. "I have been thinking," I said before she could speak. "The review will end much faster if I resign." Claire looked at me with unmistakable disappointment. "Absolutely not." I met her eyes for the first time since the meeting. "You chose me because you believed in my work. I will not become the reason people question yours." She lowered her gaze to the coffee growing cold between us. When she finally spoke, her voice was almost a whisper. "Rebecca, sometimes protecting someone means accepting a goodbye you never wanted." My heart tightened as I realized she was no longer talking about the investigation. She had already decided that the safest future for both of us might be one where our paths no longer crossed. And for the first time since I walked into that office carrying a paper cup of coffee, I was terrified that the journey changing my life was quietly leading us towards separate roads. The following Monday, I arrived at the office earlier than anyone else, hoping the quiet would help me think. Instead, it only made every unanswered question louder. Claire's resignation letter replayed endlessly in my mind. Her words about leaving had sounded calm, but beneath that calm I had heard exhaustion, sacrifice, and something she had been protecting long before I ever joined the company. I buried myself in design sketches until the first employees arrived, pretending that ordinary work could somehow restore an ordinary life. It did not. Around noon, Human Resources asked me to deliver several archived project files to the executive records room on the top floor, because the administrative assistant was homesick. The records room was rarely used, little more than rows of labeled storage cabinets and shelves filled with neatly organized binders. I found the project box I needed within minutes, but as I turned to leave, a thin blue folder slipped from the shelf above and landed at my feet. The label caught my attention immediately. Executive Succession Planning. Claire Donovan. I had no intention of reading confidential material. I bent to return it exactly where it belonged when a single loose page slid onto the floor beside my shoe. Across the bottom was Claire's unmistakable signature beside a handwritten note. Effective immediately upon board approval. Confidential until transition is complete. My eyes moved upward almost against my own will. The document confirmed that Claire had formally requested her resignation nearly 3 months before my application had even reached the company. I stood frozen. Every rumor in the office had been built on the belief that she was sacrificing her career because of me. The truth was completely different. She had already chosen to leave before she even knew I existed. The realization settled over me with unexpected force. Everything she had done afterward had not been reckless. It had been honest. She had simply refused to spend her final months leading the company the same way she had spent the years before. She wanted compassion to matter again. I quietly replaced the folder exactly where I had found it, carrying the truth with me instead. Late that afternoon, while reviewing client revisions, I received an email that had been forwarded accidentally through the executive scheduling system. Before I could close it, one line captured my attention. Claire had declined 3 separate offers from competing firms during the previous 2 months. Each position offered a larger salary and greater authority. At the bottom of the final response, she had written only one sentence. I am no longer searching for a bigger office. I am searching for a better life. My throat tightened. For the first time I understood that none of her choices had been driven by ambition anymore. They had been driven by healing. That evening I waited outside the building until most employees had gone home. Claire finally emerged carrying only a leather satchel instead of the heavy briefcase she always brought to work. She looked surprised to find me standing beside the front entrance beneath the warm glow of the streetlights. "Rebecca," she said softly, "you should have gone home." I smiled gently. "I learned something today." She searched my face, immediately sensing that something had changed. "You resigned before you ever hired me," I said. "You were never giving up your career because of me. You were trying to reclaim your life long before we met." Claire remained silent for several seconds before lowering her eyes with a quiet smile that carried equal parts relief and sadness. "I never wanted you to feel responsible," she whispered. I stepped one pace closer, leaving enough space to honor everything we had not yet said. Then stopped trying to protect me from a story that was never mine to carry. She looked up again, her hazel eyes shining beneath the city lights. Neither of us reached for the other. Neither of us needed to. For the first time since this unexpected journey began, the truth stood between us without fear, and somehow it brought us closer than any confession ever could. The board meeting ended on a quiet Friday afternoon beneath a clear October sky. No dramatic announcements echoed through the office. No whispered accusations followed anyone into the hallway. Claire's resignation was accepted with sincere appreciation for the years she had devoted to the company, and the internal review concluded exactly as it should have. Every decision surrounding my hiring and our business trip had followed company policy. Facts, it turned out, spoke more clearly than rumors ever could. Still, when I packed my desk later that evening, I realized something surprising. I was no longer afraid of losing a job. I was only afraid of walking away from another chance to live honestly. As I carried a cardboard box toward the elevator, Claire was waiting in the lobby beside the large windows overlooking Boston Harbor. She wore a simple camel coat instead of her usual tailored business suit, And for the first time since I had met her, she looked completely at peace. "I was hoping I would catch you before you left," she said. I smiled. "I think we have both spent enough time almost missing each other." She laughed softly, the sound warm and unguarded. Together we walked outside where the cool afternoon air carried the scent of salt and fallen leaves. Neither of us hurried toward our cars. There was nowhere either of us needed to be except exactly where we were. We wandered along the harbor walk as sailboats drifted across the water beneath the fading sunlight. Office buildings slowly disappeared behind us, replaced by quiet benches, weathered docks, and the steady rhythm of waves touching the shoreline. After several minutes, Claire stopped beside the railing where gulls circled above the harbor. "Do you remember what you wrote in your application?" she asked. I smiled before answering. "I wrote that I wanted to help people feel at home again." She nodded. "You already have." Her words settled gently inside me. For years I had measured my worth through marriages that lasted too long, careers that demanded too much, and expectations that were never truly mine. Standing beside Claire, I realized healing had never asked me to become someone new. It had only asked me to become myself again. Claire reached into her coat pocket and unfolded a small brochure from the seaside town in Maine where everything had quietly begun. Across the front was a photograph of an old brick storefront overlooking the harbor. "I signed a lease yesterday," she admitted with a nervous smile. "It needs a great deal of work." I looked at the picture, then back at her. "What is it going to become?" Her eyes met mine with hopeful honesty. "A small design studio. A place where homes are created with compassion before profit. A place where people are treated like people." She hesitated only briefly before adding, "I was wondering whether you might consider building it with me." My heart became impossibly still. There was no dramatic music. No crowd applauding. Only the sound of waves, distant bells, and two women who had finally stopped running from the lives they truly wanted. I stepped closer and gently took her hand, not because either of us needed rescuing, but because we had both learned the quiet courage of choosing someone freely. She smiled through grateful tears, and together we looked toward the ocean where the horizon stretched farther than either of us could see. A few months later, sunlight filled the windows of our little studio overlooking the Maine coast. Clients arrived carrying blueprints, photographs, and stories. We listened before we designed. We believed every home deserved warmth, every room deserved hope, and every new beginning deserved patience. Sometimes people asked how we had decided to start over so late in life. I always smiled because the answer was beautifully simple. The most meaningful journeys are not the ones that change the places around us. They are the ones that quietly teach us we were never too late to come home to ourselves.